The sun had not yet fully risen over Ashcombe Hall when the staff began preparing for the most important day the estate had seen in years. Maids hurried through the long corridors with fresh flowers. Footmen polished silver until it gleamed under the candlelight that still flickered before dawn gave way to morning. In the kitchen, the cook shouted orders for a breakfast fit for royalty, though no royalty was expected. Today, the engagement of Duke Edmund Ashcombe to Lady Constance Whitmore would be announced to the world. Edmund stood at his bedroom window, watching the mist rise slowly from the gardens below. He was 31 years old, tall, with dark hair beginning to show the first signs of gray at the temples. He had the calm, steady manner of a man who had spent his whole life being told what was expected of him, and who had never once questioned it. His father, the old Duke, had arranged this marriage 18 months earlier, when the family's finances had grown thin and the Whitmore family's fortune had grown strong. It was, by every measure that mattered to people of their class, a sensible match. Edmund did not love Constance. He did not dislike her either. She was intelligent, composed, and practical, much like himself. They had spent many afternoons together over the past year, discussing books, politics, and the management of great estates, and Edmund had come to respect her deeply. But respect, he knew, was not the same as love. He had simply never expected love to be part of his life. Men of his position married for duty, not for feeling. By 7 o'clock, the household staff had gathered on the lawn in front of the great stone steps of Ashcombe Hall. Tenant farmers and their families had walked from the village to witness the announcement. It was a tradition that stretched back generations, this public reading of an engagement, and the estate's land agent, a thin man named Mr. Pierce, stood ready with the formal scroll in his hands. At precisely 8 o'clock, Edmund appeared at the top of the steps, dressed in his finest dark coat. Beside him stood his father, leaning on a cane but still holding himself with pride. Lady Constance arrived moments later in a carriage from her family's estate, wearing pale blue silk that caught the early light beautifully. The crowd applauded as she climbed the steps to stand beside Edmund. Mr. Pierce unrolled the scroll and read the words that made it official. The crowd cheered. Someone in the back began to sing, and others joined in. Edmund smiled and nodded to the people he had known his whole life, accepting their congratulations with practiced grace. Constance did the same, her hand resting lightly on his arm. But even as he smiled, Edmund's eyes wandered toward the edge of the crowd, where the household staff stood in their neat rows. There, near the back, stood a young woman named Margaret Hale. She was not smiling like the others. She stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, watching the scene with an expression Edmund could not quite read. When their eyes met for a brief moment, she looked away quickly and turned to help an elderly servant who had grown tired from standing. Margaret had come to Ashcombe Hall 2 years earlier as a companion to Edmund's younger sister, Eleanor. Her duties were simple: to accompany Eleanor on walks, to read with her, to help her with her studies, and to offer guidance as she grew into a young woman. Margaret came from a respectable but modest family. Her father had been a country doctor who died when she was young, leaving little money behind. She had taken the position at Ashcombe Hall out of necessity, not desire, but she had grown to love the work, and more than that, she had grown to love the quiet rhythms of life at the great house. Over the past 2 years, Margaret had become more than just a companion to Eleanor. She had become, without either of them quite realizing it, a trusted friend to Edmund as well. It began simply enough. Edmund often worked late in the library, reviewing the estate's accounts and correspondence. Margaret, unable to sleep some nights, would sometimes find herself there too, reading by the fire after Eleanor had gone to bed. At first, they exchanged only polite words, but slowly, over many quiet evenings, their conversations grew longer and more honest. Margaret was unlike anyone else in Edmund's life. She did not flatter him simply because of his title. She spoke her mind plainly, sometimes disagreeing with him on matters of business or politics, and Edmund found himself respecting her opinions more than those of the advisors, who told him only what he wanted to hear. She made him laugh in a way he had almost forgotten how to do. She asked him questions about what he wanted for his own life, not just what was expected of him, and no one had ever asked him that before. Edmund told himself, again and again, that this friendship meant nothing more than companionship. He was engaged to Constance. Margaret was his sister's companion, a woman of modest means, with no place in the world he was bound to inherit. Society would never accept such a match, and Edmund, dutiful as always, had never seriously considered acting on the feelings that had quietly grown within him. After the formal announcement, the household moved indoors for a grand breakfast. Long tables had been set with the family's finest china, and relatives from across the country had traveled to attend. Aunts and uncles, cousins twice removed, minor nobility who had not visited Ashcombe Hall in years, all gathered to offer their congratulations and to enjoy the lavish meal prepared in their honor. Edmund sat at the head of the table beside Constance, accepting toast after toast in their honor. He smiled, he laughed at the appropriate moments, he thanked his guests for their kind words, but his mind kept drifting elsewhere. He found himself glancing toward the doorway each time it opened, hoping, though he would not admit it even to himself, to catch a glimpse of Margaret moving through the halls, managing the overflow of guests and ensuring the day ran smoothly. Margaret had been given the task of organizing the additional staff needed for such a large gathering. She moved efficiently from room to room, directing footmen, checking on the kitchen, ensuring that every guest had what they needed. She did not attend the breakfast itself, of course. Her position did not call for such things. But she worked tirelessly behind the scenes, as she always did, making certain that everything appeared effortless to those who sat at the grand table, enjoying their meal. By midday, the formal breakfast had ended, and the guests scattered across the estate to enjoy the gardens, the gallery, and the grounds, while preparations continued for the evening celebration. Edmund excused himself from a conversation with his uncle about hunting season, and walked alone through the quiet halls of the house, seeking a moment of peace. He found himself, almost without meaning to, walking toward the conservatory at the eastern end of the house. It was a glass-walled room, filled with plants and flowers, quiet and removed from the noise of the celebration. He pushed open the door and stopped in the entrance, surprised to find Margaret there, carefully removing wilted blooms from the large arrangements that had been prepared for the engagement celebration. She looked up, startled, and quickly straightened. "Your Grace," she said, using his formal title as she always did in front of others, though they were quite alone. "I did not expect anyone to come this way. I was simply tending to the flowers before this evening." "Please," Edmund said, stepping further into the room. "Continue. I did not mean to disturb you." Margaret returned to her work, though her hands moved a little less steadily than before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle clip of her scissors, as she trimmed away the dead petals. "It has been a long day," Edmund finally said, more to fill the silence than for any other reason. "It has," Margaret agreed. "But a happy one, I think, for most who attended." Something in the way she said it caught his attention. "Most?" he asked. Margaret paused, setting down her scissors. She seemed to consider her words carefully before speaking. "Forgive me, Your Grace. It is not my place to say more than that. You have never been one to hold your tongue with me before," Edmund said, a small smile touching his lips despite the seriousness in his chest. "Please, speak freely. I would rather hear your honest thoughts than another empty congratulation." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether she should truly say what was on her mind. Finally she spoke. "I only meant that congratulations are easy to give, Your Grace, but they do not always reflect what is true in a person's heart. I have watched you today, and you have smiled at every guest, but I do not think I have once seen you smile because you were truly happy." Edmund said nothing for a moment, surprised by the directness of her words, though he should not have been. This was, after all, exactly the kind of honesty he had come to value in her above all else. "You are not wrong," he admitted quietly. Margaret's expression softened, though there was something sad in her eyes as well. "I have also come to a decision of my own, Your Grace, and I think it is right that I tell you now, before the wedding plans move forward. I intend to leave Ashcombe Hall once Lady Eleanor is settled and no longer requires a companion. I believe that will not be long now, given her age." The word struck Edmund harder than he expected. "Leave? Why would you leave?" Margaret hesitated. "It seems the proper time for a change, Your Grace. Eleanor will soon be old enough that she will not need a companion much longer, and I think it best that I find my own path before too much more time passes." Edmund studied her face, searching for something beneath her carefully chosen words. "Is that the only reason?" Margaret looked away, busying herself again with the flowers, though there were no more wilted blooms left to remove. "It is reason enough, Your Grace." Edmund stood quietly for a moment, feeling something shift within him that he could not quite name. The thought of Margaret leaving Ashcombe Hall, of never again finding her in the library on a quiet evening, of never again finding her in the library on a quiet evening, of never again finding her in the library on a quiet evening, of never again finding her in the library on a quiet evening, of never again finding her in the library on a quiet evening, of never again finding her honest opinions on matters great and small. He realized, in that moment, standing among the flowers in the quiet conservatory, that the thought of marrying Constance had never once troubled him the way the thought of losing Margaret now did. It was a realization that struck him with the force of sudden clarity, as though a fog he had been living in for years had finally lifted. "Margaret," he said softly, "I must speak with my father, and with Lady Constance. There is something I need to make right before this day ends." Margaret looked at him with confusion. "Your Grace, I do not understand." "You will," Edmund said, and without further explanation, he turned and left the conservatory, his steps quick and purposeful in a way they had not been all day. He found his father first, in the study where the old Duke was resting after the long morning's events. Edmund closed the door behind him and spoke plainly, explaining that he could not go through with the marriage to Constance, not because she was unworthy, but because his heart belonged elsewhere, to a woman he had never allowed himself to properly acknowledge until this very day. His father's reaction was, as expected, one of shock and concern. He spoke of duty, of family obligation, of the financial troubles that the marriage to Constance had been meant to resolve. But Edmund, for the first time in his life, stood firm against his father's wishes. He explained that he had spent his entire life doing what was expected of him, and that he could not, in good conscience, build a marriage on practicality alone, when he now understood what it felt like to care for someone with his whole heart. The conversation was long and difficult, but by its end, the old Duke, though still troubled, agreed that he would not stand in his son's way. He recognized something in Edmund's voice that he had never heard before, a certainty that could not be argued with. Next, Edmund sought out Lady Constance, finding her in the rose garden with several of her relatives. He asked if he might speak with her privately, and she agreed, sensing perhaps that something serious weighed on his mind. They walked together along a quiet path, away from the celebration, and Edmund explained, as gently and honestly as he could, that he did not believe he could be the husband she deserved. He told her that he had come to care deeply for someone else, someone he had not allowed himself to recognize his feelings for until that very day, and that it would be wrong for him to proceed with their marriage while his heart belonged elsewhere. Constance listened quietly, and when he finished, she did not respond with anger, as he had feared she might. Instead, she looked at him with a kind of thoughtful understanding that surprised him. "I confess," she said slowly, "that I have sensed for some time that your heart was not fully present, even when you sat beside me. I told myself it did not matter, that our marriage would still be a good one built on respect and shared purpose. But I think, in truth, I deserve more than that, just as you do." She paused, looking out over the garden. "I release you from our engagement, Edmund, and I wish you happiness, truly, with whomever has earned your heart." Edmund thanked her, deeply moved by her grace and understanding, and the two parted as friends rather than enemies, both relieved in their own way that honesty had prevailed over duty. As the afternoon turned to evening, word of the broken engagement began to spread quietly through the household, though Edmund asked that no public announcement be made until he had spoken with Margaret. He found her once more in the conservatory, where the evening light was beginning to fade through the glass walls, casting long golden shadows across the flowers and leaves. Margaret looked up as he entered, and something in his expression told her that the day had brought changes she could not yet understand. "Your Grace," she said softly, "what has happened?" Edmund crossed the room and stood before her, taking her hands gently in his own. "I have ended my engagement to Lady Constance," he said simply, "and I have spoken with my father. Margaret, I do not wish for you to leave Ashcombe Hall. I do not wish for you to ever leave my side, if you will have me." Margaret stared at him, scarcely able to believe the words she was hearing. "Edmund," she whispered, using his given name for what may have been the first time, "this is madness. Society will never accept such a match. Your family's fortunes, your father's hopes, everything you have worked toward, none of it matters to me as much as you do," Edmund interrupted gently. "I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, marrying for duty, living for obligation. But today, for the first time, I understand what it means to choose something for myself, because my heart demands it rather than my position. I am asking you, Margaret, to marry me, not out of practicality, not out of arrangement, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, though she smiled through them. "Then yes," she said softly, "yes, I will marry you." As the last light of the sunset filtered through the glass walls of the conservatory, casting warm colors across the flowers and across the two of them standing together, Edmund and Margaret remained there for a long while, simply holding each other, aware that scandal and difficulty surely awaited them in the days ahead, but unwilling to let that uncertainty steal away this moment of true happiness. By the time the candles were lit for the evening celebration, word had begun to spread through Ashcombe Hall that the Duke had broken one engagement that day, only to begin another before the sun had fully set. Some among the family and the wider society would speak of scandal in the months that followed, but those who knew Edmund and Margaret best understood that they had witnessed something rare, a man who had spent his life following the path laid out for him, finally choosing, for the very first time, a path of his own.